Hello, my name is Alexander Solozhin. I'm an RA here at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. For our War Observatory project, we are conducting a series of interviews with experts in various academic fields relevant to the war in Ukraine. In this series, we cover basic and advanced subject matters relevant to the war. We intend for these videos to be used as teaching materials for faculty and students in Canada and around the world. Joining me here today to answer a few questions regarding the war in Ukraine is Dr. Paul Goode. Dr. Paul Goode is an associate professor and Macmillan Chair of Russian Studies at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. His current research broadly focuses on nationalism and authoritarianism in Russia and the former Soviet states. Professor Goode is editor-in-chief of Communist and Post-Communist Studies and associate editor of Nationalities Papers. He also serves on the editorial boards for Russian Politics and Social Science Quarterly, and the advisory board for Nations and Nationalism. He is a long-standing member of the program committee and the advisory board for the Association for the Study of Nationalities. So polling is difficult to conduct and properly interpret in the context of war. Nevertheless, what do we know about the opinions and views of everyday Russians, and is there a resistance among everyday Russians to the war?
Yeah, these are important questions. They're also some of the hardest to answer. And so let's just start with opinion polling. Why is opinion polling difficult? It's difficult because, first of all, a lot of Russians, even before the war, didn't really believe that survey responses were anonymous. They believed that survey responses, as many as 25% prior to the war reported believing that their responses were monitored by the authorities. Now, you can imagine that people's concerns about that increase after the start of the war, especially with increased censorship in the media and especially censorship of social media, right? And so for a lot of people, it's unclear whether they would feel comfortable voicing opposition to the war, even in a face-to-face interview setting, particularly because Russia's government has adopted some pretty draconian laws punishing people for things that it calls, like, for instance, the discrediting of the Russian army. And so in this regard, we have to take any opinion polls with a grain of salt because we just don't really know to what extent they're widespread. And likewise, we don't know to what extent polling firms themselves are also subject to the same legal punishments insofar as, is it legitimate to ask people about opposition to the war? If you ask people about that, can you be denounced to the prosecutor's office, right? That's a possibility as well. And so it's likelihood that both survey instruments as well as survey responses are tainted by the war itself. And that these are not going to be as useful guides as maybe they could be during peace times. Now, having said that, what we know from the existing survey research that's out there is that a majority of the Russian public expresses their support for the war when asked in a survey. And those results can be anywhere from 55 up to close to 80%. More often, they tend to fall sort of like in the 60% range. So we take those with a grain of salt, but they do resonate with kind of what we saw in 2014, insofar as there was a lot of public support for the annexation of Crimea. There was a lot of support for that first invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And so it's not totally surprising. Having said that, this is not 2014, right? And we don't see the wave of support, the wave of enthusiasm that followed the annexation of Crimea today. That's just not anywhere in evidence. There is, some open displays of support for the war. One of the things that has been most mysterious about the war has been the use of symbolism for demonstrating one's support. So you see the letters V or Z, the Latin letters that have been used now for expressing support for the war. The Z is sometimes used for the za as in for, so za something. It could be for victory, it can be for the president, it can be for truth, it can be for lots of different things. Which also means it's basically for nothing, right? It can be for anything, but it's not really clear what people stand for, aside from the fact that ultimately it's a conspicuous display of loyalty. And in that sense, we are well aware that there are social pressures and also increasingly societal pressures within, say, workplace environments and within bureaucracy to display one's credentials as a patriot. So this is what political scientists, social scientists might refer to as preference falsification, as in when you have clear incentives to, demonstrate your opinion is, in conformity with social expectations, even if privately your opinion diverges from those expectations. And this is not a new thing, of course. This is something that a lot of people experienced during the Soviet era within Russia as well. Now, anecdotally, talking to people from Russia, what we hear is that the war is something that is constantly in people's minds, right? But it's not something that's really discussed. It's treated kind of like an open secret. Everybody knows, everybody's in the know. It's not something you have to talk about, but people draw those connections. And of course, there are a lot of people that are ambivalent. They neither support, they neither oppose, they just want to get on with their day-to-day lives, right? And so many behave as if nothing's happened. And one of the things that I think has facilitated that has been that the Russian government has avoided mass mobilization to this point, a mass call-up. So from the standpoint of, an ordinary Russian within a Russian information environment, what you see now is not necessarily a radical break from what Russians have seen for the last 8 years. The West is against us. Ukraine's against us. There's fascists in Ukraine, allegedly, and we're fighting to support people in the Donbass. None of this really breaks from what Russia has been saying since 2014. And so it's very easy, I think, for people who are ambivalent just to treat all of this as background noise. And partly that's been helped by the fact that Russia has been very careful about not beating people over the heads with it in the media or elsewhere in public. And this is something also that we've been keeping a close eye on. But clearly, sort of like there is also a lot of anxiety and uncertainty about the future. And whether people support the war or not, that is something that is inevitably connected with the war. So people's economic futures, there's the livelihoods, what's going to happen for their kids or for their own personal businesses. Many Russians don't have savings. Many Russians expect a decline in living standards over the coming months, if not the coming years. Most do not have the resources to leave the country or to relocate. And so it's also not just a question of whether you support or oppose the war, whether you're ambivalent, but also whether or not you actually have any choice in the matter. And most Russians do not have a choice. They are, one way or the other, they are part of this war, whether they like it or not. And that is something which is an unavoidable fact of day-to-day life. And so some people embrace it, some people retreat to a safe space cognitively. With regards to resistance within Russia, yes, there is resistance. Now, according to the site OVD Info, about a little bit more than 16,000 people have been arrested since the start of the war for anti-war activities. Now, the bulk of those really came early on in the early days of the war, before there were these laws that were passed that cracked down on public protests as well as on social media protests. There's almost no elite opposition to the war, almost none. There was some coded opposition amongst members of the oligarchy, for instance, or members of the people who are sort of like regime insiders. But these were really sort of not intended for mass distribution, right? It wasn't an attempt to sort of like rally resistance, and they faded very quickly. Back in May, a Russian diplomat who was based in Geneva publicly criticized the war and resigned from his post. And one of the things that really was striking that came out of his resignation was he indicated that not only is there a widespread support for the war in Russian officialdom, but that the bureaucracy tells the Kremlin what it wants to hear, not what's actually going on. So regardless of what people in officialdom believe, there is clearly a sense that there is an expected line that one is to follow. And we do know from the comparative literature and on authoritarianism and the domestic politics research on Russia that people who are dependent on the public sector for their livelihood, these are the key sources for support for Putin's regime. And this has been so in the past, it almost certainly is going to increase going forward as sanctions continue to take hold and as people become more and more dependent upon the state sector for their survival. And so in this sense, not only has there been very little opposition on the elite level, I think it's unlikely that it would arise under the current conditions. Now, there does remain some societal opposition, but it's very coded, right? And so one of the things that you see, for instance, one of the ways that this manifests is in the use of green ribbons, or green chalk, marks. Why green? Because green is blue plus yellow, right? So the colors of the Ukrainian flag combined makes green. You can get punished for displaying Ukrainian flag colors, but green, not so much. So this is one of the things we see, and it's a way basically that people mark for one another, that there is at least some societal awareness of opposition, even if it's not something that people feel like they can, stage openly. And then there's also signs of more militant opposition that have been arising. Now, this is sporadic. I wouldn't call it an organized campaign, but there are signs that there have been, for instance, reports of sabotage. The firebombing of regional military recruitment headquarters is one of the things we've seen. We've also seen, for instance, the sabotaging of interrail connections, not just in Russia, but also in Belarus. And so there is opposition, but it is impossible to gauge how widespread it is, in part because so much of it has been forced underground since the start of the war.
Thank you. And then moving on to our last question, how has the Russian media and specifically the state-owned media portrayed the war in Russia?
So the media has been portraying the war in it's used a series of different tropes or narratives, if you will, for explaining what Russia is doing and why. And, one of the things that was similar with the way that Russia started this war with the ways it started its past wars, say, if you think about sort of the war with Georgia in 2008, is that it started off by making wide and frequent claims of genocide being undertaken in Ukraine. Now, this is something that accelerated in the couple of weeks prior to the invasion, and so it was very clearly part of a coordinated campaign. This is one of the ways we can tell. And it's also something that dropped off immediately afterwards, as in within a couple of weeks, nobody was talking about genocide anymore. That was then replaced by, for instance, a variety of other narratives. So one of the things that became popular for a while was the discussion of the likelihood that Ukraine might use nuclear weapons or possibly resort to make use of a dirty nuclear bomb out of desperation. Or another variant of this was that nationalists would pressure Zelensky, Ukrainian President Zelensky, to make use of nuclear weapons, in a desperate bid to save power. But these also sort of got tamped down in part because the theories about the presence of nuclear weapons coincided with Russia's sort of bungled seizing of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which made nobody feel any more comfortable about the situation. There was also the theory about biological weapons labs with weapons that were intended to target specifically Russian DNA and that were funded by the U.S. State Department in a complex scheme of or web of international funding. And this is another story that's sort of risen and fallen over time. But ultimately, if you look at the full sweep of media reporting since February up until the present, a couple of things really stand out. So the first thing is that the variety of enemy plots, schemes, explanations, rationales, these have all largely sort of faded, as in they all sort of are kept in circulation. But if we think about what constitutes background noise on television, right, the thing that probably best constitutes sort of the threshold for determining what counts as background noise is weather reporting, because weather reporting is the one thing that is reported relatively objectively in Russian television, right? Now, if we look at these different plots and how they're reported, they all fall well below the line. They're reported far less frequently than the weather. And that tells us something very important, which is that even though these stories keep going and they appeal to very sort of specific niches or very specific constituencies, they're not intended for mass appeal. What we do see rising above that line is the notion that Russia is acting in humanitarian interests and this is usually expressed by way of liberation, the concept of liberation, that Russia is liberating territories, liberating people. It's even liberating the world because this is not just a fight for Donbass or for Ukraine, but also a fight for, the world order free of Western hegemony. The other thing that doesn't rise above than the background noise is what the West wants, what Ukraine wants, what anybody else wants. Russia's enemies have no rational motives. All they have is a hatred of Russia. They're driven by Russophobia. And so it becomes then in Russia's media a depiction of an existential conflict, right? Russia is acting in its own best interests and in Ukraine's best interests to liberate, as it calls it, to denazify, demilitarize, and it's opposed by those who simply hate Russia. They have no motives otherwise, right? And so this is a very powerful enemy image, and it's one that is constantly circulated. Now, things get a little bit more interesting if we look not just at federal television, but if we look at regional media, right? How things are being reported in, the various different provinces across Russia. And here, everything about the war basically dropped off the map within a month. The only thing that now consistently rises above background noise on the regional media is sanctions, but nothing else. And so again, this is part of a strategy. The idea is to avoid clubbing Russians over the head with the war, right? It's not about mobilizing, it's about demobilizing. It's about making sure that Russians don't see this as a rupture with normality, but rather to normalize the state of war, to normalize anti-Westernism, to normalize confrontation, and to understand that this is just the way the world is. The world hates Russia. So, if you don't like it, what else are you going to do? And as far as sanctions goes, all of the rhetoric that's been developed around sanctions since 2014 has now been redeployed. So the idea that Russia can replace whatever it's lost through import substitution, the Russians are better off without foreign competitors, that Russia can make productive ties with the rest of the world outside of the West. These sorts of things are now once again in active circulation. And so again, from the standpoint of an ordinary Russian, all of this looks like, business as usual from their perspective. It's not a rupture with normality.